Okay, chapter 27, Romanticism. Let's get back to it. We're going to take a look at Goya, and the first one we're going to look at is figure 27.10. And you remember with Romanticism, it's very much about intuition and emotion and imagination and kind of a fantasy-like imagery versus that of the very linear qualities of neoclassicism. But don't forget that these romantic painters and artists, they still embraced the neoclassicism, just not as the only answer, because that's part of this Enlightenment period, is that it's both about reason and truth and intuition at the same time, and imagination, is that they're both the balancing factors of this Enlightenment. So you will see artists like we saw with Blake in the last video, it's still going to have some elements of neoclassicism in it. And Goya is actually going to have a hard time breaking away from neoclassicism, but he does ultimately do it. And then also Goya is in Spain at this time. Well, I'm sorry, he is in Spain, and he's the painter for the king of Spain, Charles. And so again, it's going to take him a little while to move away from neoclassicism, but he ultimately will. In this example, the sleep of reason produces monsters is kind of a segue transitional difficulty in moving away from neoclassicism. First of all, this is an etch, like we saw with William Blake's piece in the last video. So, and again, the etch is when you have your metal plate and you place a wax encaustic on it, and then you carve in the wax, and then you put your ink down, and then it transfers onto the paper, and it gives it a very moody, like granular look, almost like graphite rubbing over the top of a piece of really gritty paper. Okay, and that's what etching does. It doesn't give you a lot of sharp edges. It gives you more of this flowing, emotional-like edge, which fits well with the romantic painters versus the hard edges that are often seen in the classical painting, the neoclassical artist. So what this is depicting, it's depicting these dreamt monsters that are actually, well, it's two things. It's in and it's out. The in is that these are considered monsters that are placating an individual while sleeping, and it's an emphasis on too much reason, and too much focus on logic and reason can become almost demoniac or monstrous at times. So there's that. There's the idea that this is portraying how pure reason and ultimate logic can stifle you as an individual. Too much intelligence or too much intellect can make you less human, so to speak, and not allow you to tap into the other levels of emotion and intuition that are part of you as a human. So that's one aspect of what these monsters are, and hence the sleep of reason, right? So reason being that neoclassical part of enlightenment. The second is that it's possible that they could be releases of imagination, like these monsters, because the romantics were very much interested in kind of the macabre and the distortions and the imagination and a little bit of horror and a little bit of violence, which we'll see with some more paintings coming up, or with some more artwork. This isn't a painting, this is a printmaking. But it also could mean the out. So I talked about the in, meaning that it's suppressing you. The reason and logic could be suppressing you as a person. And the out is that through these dreams, because the romantics would rely on their dreams for inspiration. We talked about that with William Blake. Is that these monsters actually could be creations and designs coming from the thinking and the dreaming subconsciously of Goya. all right, or of this individual that is at rest. Okay, so it could be either or. It could be the monsters could be elements of reason, placating a romantic who's dreaming, or they could be these manifestations coming from his thoughts. So again, that's just a reflection on how Goya is transitioning from the neoclassical idea into more of the romantic concepts. And we can see that the romantic concepts even more so in 27.11. The 3rd of May, 1808. Now, the one thing that really makes this more classical and neoclassical, the only real thing is that the event is factual. It's historical. And we've noticed that about the neoclassical paintings, even all the way back to David in the last chapter, where it was very much about righteousness, patriotism, and morality. And that's what this is about. Okay, this is about morality, this is about patriotism. And in particular, in Spain, patriotism in Spain versus the invasion of the French. And I'll talk about that. So, that's what connects it to being still a little neoclassical. And so these romantics, they still didn't get rid of neoclassicalism completely. All right? Goya in particular. So it's a contemporary event. And the event is, and what happened, is Napoleon Bonaparte, he helped to install another Spanish king. All right, so he assisted in the usurping of a king to replace the son of that king into power in Spain. But right after that son was installed to be king of Spain, Napoleon, pulls him off the throne, and then Napoleon puts his brother in the place of that kingdom, or of that leadership. So Napoleon puts his own brother as the leader of Spain at that time. Now, one thing we don't have images of here in this text is that Goya actually used his printmaking techniques, like we saw in figure 2710, right? And he made lots and lots and lots of prints based off of this, what is being considered now an invasion from the French. It was originally, could you come and help us? And then after they helped him, Napoleon decided, yeah, I'm done helping you. I now want to take over Spain. So now it became an invasion of the French into Spain. So Goya made a whole bunch of prints to showcase different events of the massacres that were happening around Spain from the French invasion. And he had them distributed. And through this distribution of prints and making posters through these prints, people from around the country were able to see what the French were doing and how they tricked the Spanish. They tricked the Spaniards. And so what happened is revolt. And then this is an example, figure 27.11, 3rd of May, 1808, of the citizens of Spain revolting against the French. And they ultimately got them out of there. They drove them out. The Spanish drove the French out. But a lot of people died because of it. So in 1808, hence the title of this, in May, so again, a very historical event. Goya is capturing a contemporary event at this time. Is that the Spanish citizens realized that the French were invading and they fought back. Now, with that all aside, he embraced Romanticism to really give empathy to the Spanish, of course, and to make the French look like demons, to make the French look really bad for obvious reasons. And so what he did is he decided not to show an image of what's going to happen before the revolts, before the Spanish decide to drive the French out, and kind of like the heroic ready to march into battle. He decided to show what was actually going on, and that's the violence and the massacre behind it, which is a very romantic decision, okay, which gives so much weight of empathy to the Spanish by choosing to show what was actually going on, the massacre after a revolt. And how he creates that empathy for the Spanish and anguish for them is that within their faces, he creates the anguish, and the Spanish are the ones to the center left, and then the French are the ones with the guns center right. And in the faces of the Spanish, you can see the anguish. And what that does is it increases empathy for them tenfold. And you got to realize while he's doing this painting, he's also distributing prints that are showing similar things. So people are getting it all around the country, all around the kingdom. And they're all up in arms, which is great. Created this propaganda that was necessary to get people to drive the French out. So he creates an anguish in the faces of the Spanish, but then he creates a facelessness and places the French in the shadows. And the light is upon the Spanish, the light is not upon the French. Okay? So by that he creates a system of emotion, right? He's creating this whole layer of emotion from this angst and this anguish to this complete cold callousness of the French. But he does something that's very unique, and that is he creates implied time through the emotions of the Spanish. And how he does that is in the foreground you have the unfortunate ones that have already been massacred. So that's the past. The present is the individual in the white shirt having this almost martyrdom or cruciformed is a word, C-R-U-C-I-F-O-R-M, cruciformed position, to relate him to the martyrdom of Christ, to Jesus. So that's happening at the present. And then what's happening in the future is the line of the Spanish to the left of the cruciformed man that are going to be next to be shot. So he's creating a system of implied time through this system of emotion and anguish in the figures, in the Spanish. Okay? So that's a totally new technique altogether, and that's what makes Francisco Goya one of the leading romantic painters. Still using a little bit of the neoclassicism, though. Don't forget that, with the historical depiction. Okay, so that's Goya. Powerhouse. Just absolute powerhouse. And that sense of violence and torture and almost horror of the Romantics is going to get even greater. And we can see it in figure 27.14 with Heracles, Wrath of the Medusa. And again, a historical event. So what the event is that there was a shipwreck of a great ship, and then this shipwreck occurred, and there was over 140 individuals that survived, and the carpenter survived. And the carpenter survived and found all of the individual pieces, some individual pieces from the wreckage, and started hammering it all together to make this huge raft. And then ultimately only 15 survived, and they had to eat each other. So cannibalism was involved, literally on this raft of the Medusa. Okay, so it's actually a historical event, and the reason well portrayed in this way is the romanticism that's involved. There are some very subtle neoclassical elements to it, which I'll talk about. But what he was trying to do, Gericult, is to show, because the captain of the ship that wrecked the ship originally was placed in there for political reasons. And he's showing that at this time, during these revolutions that are happening throughout Europe, that you can't always put your faith in the hands of someone who's politically chosen. Sometimes the people themselves need to be the ones that make this decision, not hierarchies. And this is the result of a misinformed hierarchy, a poor system of leadership, is that it leads to this violence and this horror and this cannibalism. And that's what this painting is really reflecting in that historical relevance. All right, that appointed captain was appointed for political reasons. And this is what happens, shipwreck. Okay? Now, the emotions involved here are obviously chaos, horror, and tragedy when a quote-unquote reasonable man is at the helm. So again, this has to do with, it can't all be about reason and logic coming from individuals that may not have reason and logic, but say that they do. False charlatans. So they place this captain in position thinking this is the reasonable person to do it. This is a reasonable decision. And then this is what happens. So it's a romantic in that you can't forget the emotional need, and it's coupled with that enlightenment. You can't forget that there's this emotional undercurrent of life that's happening beyond this superficial hard veneer of reason and truth. So that's the romantic context behind this, kind of a pushback against reason, so to speak. Now, what's really new about this, that's kind of coming from a little bit of the neoclassicism, is that he's creating a compositional formula. He's actually creating an X. And he has a light line of the X that's leading from the bottom left of the body that's barely hanging onto the boat, all the way up to the young gentleman that's trying to wave down another ship for them to see them. All right, so that creates a white line, or a light line, not a white line, but a line of light. Then you have a line of dark that starts in the center left on the top of the sail all the way down to the figure that looks like is just falling off of the raft, like already dead corpse that's just falling off the raft. Okay, so it creates this obtuse or asymmetrical X-like shape, offset X. Okay, so that's a compositional formula that he is deriving from parts of the classical, neoclassical techniques. Okay, but that X is meant to represent more than, so that's the mathematics, that's the reason involved in the composition. But it also creates, by using an X instead of a triangle or a rectangle or a circle, that X is meant to again reinforce the romantic elements of suffering, disparity, and of course death. So using these old classical techniques to give a romantic allegory, if you will, an allegory of suffering, death that occurs when you don't embrace intuition and emotion and all these other things that come from the heart. Because I'm sure they said this captain probably isn't the best choice. Our intuition is telling us that, and this is what happens. Reason isn't always the best choice. Sometimes intuition is required. So romanticism. All right, I talked about the X and how you have a line of light and a line of darkness. And then also positioning the raft in a diagonal gives it a sense of implied motion, which is a romantic thing to do. It looks as if that corpse is just going off of the raft by creating that diagonal of the raft instead of it being horizontal or more of like an aerial perspective. Okay? So intentional to create this life even in this death. This animation in this collection of death. And another thing that's very much about romanticism is the clustering of bodies. And he's doing that here, clustering them. And we'll see that in a sculpture coming up as well, as this desire to cluster. Kind of put everybody in a big pile. Okay. The last thing which I love is that he's actually an abolitionist. And that means that he is really trying to stop the slavery trade, and especially in America at this time. This is 1818, 1819, a good, almost 40 years before the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation in America, the freeing of slaves. So he was an abolitionist trying to move that. So what he does beautifully is on the very top right there, that individual at the end of the line of light is the only black gentleman present in this composition, and he's the one waving the flag. He's the one saying, here we are, and he's elevated and he's lifted up on the shoulders of everyone else. And that emphasizes his abolitionist viewpoints, which is the freedom of all slaves and giving them their freedom and their liberty. So he incorporates that in this painting, which makes his painting even better. Okay, so that's Guericot. And now let's look at a piece of sculpture. We've looked at a lot of paintings. All right, there's not a lot of sculpture during this time. Again, it's going to be mostly painting. Okay, we're going to look at figure 27.18. This is Rude. R-U-D-E, Rude. And this is Departure of the Volunteers in 1792. And again, it's going to be a composite of neoclassicism and romanticism. All right? It's just they both, it's more romantic, but still you can't, it's the whole Enlightenment thing, right? You've got to have both. You got to have reason, you got to have intuition. You got to have mind, you have to have heart. You have to have both. So we as humans have both. So we need to experience and use both of them and couple them together. And that's what these artists are all about during this Enlightenment. So sculpture, the first time we see sculpture. What kind of sculpture is this? This is considered a high relief sculpture. A high relief sculpture. Okay? It combines neoclassicism and romanticism. It is placed on Napoleon's arch, so you can see that arch is 27.18a, the next slide. All right, it's one of the relief pieces on that. And it's a combination of a Roman god, liberty, and the diverse patriots that are present during the revolution of France, coming out of the Kingdom of France from the Louis and into Napoleon's rule. The forms that make it neoclassical is that they are classical forms, that very virile and strong and muscular like embodiment. Okay, so that's very much what makes it classical, right? And the fact that it's a relief, which is a technique found in Greco-Roman times, especially Greece. Heavy relief carvings found on the Parthenon, on the Temple of Athena, all of them, in Athens in particular. So it makes it very classical. So that's the emphasis on the neoclassical. Now what makes it romantic is the violent motion forward, all right? The charging of the god of war, goddess of war actually, flying forward in the air, pushing forward, which is making it have this thrusted like violent, almost aggressive like motion to our left. All right? And the density, and what I mean by that again is the clustering of bodies. That's romantic. We saw it with the raft of the Medusa, right? We saw the clustering of bodies. We saw the clustering of the monsters in Goya's print, right? With the reason print that that creates the monsters. We saw that. We can see the clustering of the bodies in the 3rd of May in 1808 of Goya. So clustering, making it very dense, full of bodies. And that's what's happening here in Departure of the Volunteers of 1792. And then also the jaggedness. The jaggedness versus making it like sharp or making it like perfect angles moving into one another. It's very jagged. It's very textured based off of the jagged. So the texture or the tactility comes from this jaggedness. And again, that's a romantic decision. Okay, and like I mentioned at the very beginning of the other video, is this move into the urban setting, into the cities, because of the Industrial Revolution, is going to make people nostalgic for a soft, organic, natural landscape. So, with the countryside, with that, the money, the disposable money that's coming in by living in the cities and working in the Industrial Revolution, is opening waves for purchasing landscape paintings. And there's 2 landscape painters I want to talk about. One is Constable and the other is Turner. Okay, but real quick, let me reiterate: with the train system and the Industrial Revolution moving people into the cities, it increased a level of tourism. All right, out into the countries as well. So these people lived in the city; they moved to the city for the Industrial Revolution, but the train system and the mass transit system with the trains allowed people to go and vacation out in the country, let's say for the weekend or for a day, and bring them back, and then they go back to work on Monday or whatever. Okay? So with that, when they go back to the urban areas, they want something to bring back with them. So these landscape paintings are kind of like mirrors into this wooded, open-fielded landscape that they want to be part of. So the increase in tourism because of the train systems increases the interest in landscape paintings. And a new term comes into existence because of this. And it's called picturesque. I'm sure you've heard it before. Picturesque. Picturesque. And what picturesque means is that is worthy of being painted. So, this Industrial Revolution generated this level of interest in landscape painting, and the landscape painting came from a picturesque decision, meaning these individuals felt that it was worthy of painting because they wanted to have them back in their homes, in the cities. So Constable creates the Hay Wain, figure 27.21, and it's actually it's serene and it's very calm, but at this time during the Industrial Revolution, what was actually happening is an agrarian upheaval and a crisis out in the countries, because these individuals that had these farms, they were no longer allowed to just farm their small plots of land. There was more of a need for bigger farms to be grown. So there was an agrarian crisis at this time. But Constable does not depict that. Instead, he depicts a more serene-like environment, which is what makes it very controversial. You would think that tranquility and serenity wouldn't create controversy, but it is, because during this time people were actually thieving one another. There was lots of upheaval out in the country, lots of crime, but he's not depicting that. He's depicting the opposite. All right, so that's what makes this a little controversial. Now, another thing that he does that his predecessors really didn't do is that he would sketch outside with oil. So typically they would sketch or use pastels and draw out the over idea, then take it into a studio and finish it up. But he would sketch outside using the oil, so he captured the true essence of the outdoors by choosing to use oil to sketch outside instead of pastels or graphite material for drawing. And by doing that, he was able to really see the textures in the material by using the oil to build up the textures right away. And he focused on what is a new term, local color, Local, color, local color. And that built up the texture. Now, what local color is that is a color that is synonymous to that object. For example, we relate blues to the sky during certain times of the day. We relate grays and whites and blacks as neutrals in the clouds, depending on the shifting of the weather. We often will localize greens and yellows in the trees, as well as browns in the trunks of the trees, browns and grays. So those are called local colors, whenever the color is synonymous to that object in nature. So he would focus us on local colors, build up those local colors, and that's what would build the texture using the oil. And then he would come back and dab little amounts of white and silver on top of the local colors to imply a sense of light and motion, as if the wind is blowing through the clouds or through the trees or over the water. Okay? So using little highlights of white and silver to emphasize the textural buildup of those local colors. And again, he used this serenity in the emotions during an actual time of unrest, which again is what makes it very romantic. All right? So by choosing an emotion of serenity and softness, he's kind of going around the whole element of unrest and violence, but he's still discussing it indirectly. Because when you put this painting up to show an agrarian environment that's actually an upheaval, people are going to be like, that's not what's going on out there in the country. So it makes you think about the romantic emotions involved in the agrarian upheaval during the Industrial Revolution, but it's indirect, it's subtle. That's why this painting is so important. Then you have Turner in figure 27.22, who's just throwing it all out there and showing you the emotions right away. All right, and the disgust of what's going on in the industrial age. For example, the slave trade. This is called the slave ship. So using the emotional disgust of this barbaric scene. Again, it is a historical scene. And what the scene is this captain who's moving slaves from Africa up to Liverpool has been told that he only has insurance on any individuals that don't make it to Liverpool, meaning they fall off the boat. And he had a whole bunch of individuals from Africa that were sick that were not going to make it, but he wasn't insured for it. So his disgusting demeanor was to toss them overboard so he can claim the insurance. Turner picked up on this story and exposed it for what it was. And that's one thing that the Romantics did, is they took something that was considered during a time of reason and logic with the Enlightenment, and they said, bullshit. This is what's going on too. And I'm going to expose it for what it is. And it's going to be very emotional. And that's exactly what he did. Turner, another abolitionist as well, wanting this slave trade to stop. So that's what his painting is all about. Now, how does he do that? Is he creates a level of emotion in the color. He makes the sun look as if it's a comet or the eye of God looking upon this in wrath, in fiery wrath, taking note of the action of the captain tossing these humans over the rails into the ocean. All right? And then he shrouds that eye of the sun, this comet, like this apocalyptic scene, like wrath, like this is why I'm going to bring this world to an end. These kinds of actions. That's what the color is doing. It's setting up that angry, aggressive, wrathful emotion. And he shrouds that comet sunlight with crimson or scarlet red to denote the murder of these individuals. The choice of that color from the scarlet to the yellow to the orange is to show the ugliness of this murder scene, which is exactly what it is. And then he uses low detail and casts the ship off into the distance to make it insignificant. It's significant to portray the emotions behind this unfortunate event, but he minimizes the detail of the ship to make it seem that those individuals were actually are actually the insignificant ones. And then he emphasizes on more detail in the individuals that are in the water to give them emphasis, to give them justice. So they're emphasized through this light and this comet that is coming behind the clouds and this haziness. Okay, and so this romantic painter Turner wanted to emphasize how hazy the reason and logic of this time actually was. And we have to use our intuition to explore that and to be able to go, no, you are not a good leader. You must be removed. You are not a proper captain. You must be removed. Just like with the raft of Medusa that we saw. All right? So the Romantics became very political in their emotions and in the use of the colors. It's not meant to be serene. It's meant to be disgusting. It's meant to be barbaric in nature. Through this color, the color is supposed to expose that. The turbulence. And one thing that's been that I've always kind of thought of is the sea looks choked up and bothered by this situation. The sea is like turbulent and overwhelmed by what's been placed in it, and the act that has unfolded under its supervision, if you will. So the sea looks choked up by emotion, and that again is the use of these colors to give that sense of choked upness. All right, and it just makes it more intense. So the Romantics were very much about intense situations, intense imagery to tell the truth. So the truth through emotion instead of the truth through reason and logic. All right, I'll leave you at that, and we'll move into realism and photography in the next video.